Hello all, I'm Marguerite Vera, class of 1979, celebrating our 42nd reunion. I have the privilege of introducing my classmate and friend, David Ayón, and my college roomie and friend, Donna Staton. David, as I remember from freshman year, quickly became known as a campus activist. He could routinely be found at the Third World Center, probably where I first met him. On the governance board with his good friend, David Adams, class of 78, or working on a Chicano caucus, of which he was a founding member. Or at what for me was our lunchtime anti-apartheid demonstrations, marching daily around Nassau Hall. David was and is one of my favorite memories of Princeton some 42 years later. He wrote his thesis on Chicano politics. So it's no stretch of the imagination to find that after attending Stanford for graduate school in Latin American politics, he would wind up teaching Latin American politics, immigration, and other related topics at various California universities. You will hear from him today about his Power Shift project, which involves a number of projected books. The first of which, Power Shift, How Latinos in California Transformed Politics in America, is being discussed today. Donna Staton was my roomie in a suite at 121 Laurie Love with 4 other great women. The building no longer exists, but our friendships remain strong. Donna has a long list of leadership accomplishments in both public and private organizations, which has put her on the list of Maryland's top 100 women twice and garnered numerous other professional and civic awards. She's the co-founder of the Decision Point Strategy Group and Decision Point Law. A former law partner and judge with a long history of not-for-profit board and civic service, she currently serves on the board of Howard Bank, and she's a trustee at George Washington University. I invite you all to an engaging conversation with David and Donna. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. Although there is time at the end of the session for questions and answers, Donna will be checking and posing your questions to David throughout. Now for our conversation, I turn it over to you, Donna and David.
Well, Marguerite, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Your check is in the mail. And I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to catch up with David. We've bonded in recent years through Facebook over our common love and affection for Hamilton, the musical. But this time we get to talk about a different kind of history project. And I couldn't be more excited to have David share with you, as he has with me, the work that he's been doing in this amazing book, Power Shift, How Latinos in California Transformed Politics in America. Hi, David.
Hi, Donna. How you doing? You hear me okay?
I can hear you great, and I hope that everyone else can hear us all right, and I'm sure they will let us know if there are any technical problems. So let's talk about this fabulous book that you've written. And I've got to say, I'm always impressed with anyone who's actually able to follow through on their interest in writing a book. But not only have you written a book, but you've written a very good book, and one that is very detailed. It brings to life the personalities and the good works of some very important people who I imagine, if you didn't know them before, after you did all the research on them, really became part of your own family. Let's talk about the book, what it is that you mean by transforming politics, and talk a little bit about the 10 people who are really the stars of your show.
Yeah, and I wish I could make the screen share work properly. It was working a second ago, but I couldn't see the cursor and control it. So I'm just going to have to talk about the people. I once had a professor in grad school, I think it was, that said, maybe you should say what you're trying to explain before you explain it, right? And in a way, if this book explains something, It explains how Latinos, with a focus on California in particular, starting on the east side of LA, how Latinos went from being completely absent, I mean, utterly absent. There was not a single Latino elected official of any significance in the whole state of California at the beginning of this story. And what this does is tell how that happened, how that changed. By the time I came to California myself, I'm not a native, but I came straight out to go to grad school out here after graduating from Princeton. You still only had one Latino member of Congress, just like maybe five, a handful in the state legislature, nobody on the LA City Council, no Latina or Latino on the LA County Board of Supervisors, no statewide elected officials, no county or citywide elected officials in 1979. And that doesn't seem that long ago to us. I guess for a lot of people, that's ancient history. But things started to change. That one that was in Congress was the breakthrough back in 1949 when he was elected to the LA City Council. His name is Ed Roybal. He passed away in 2005, but he's sort of like the founding father, so to speak, of Latino political empowerment certainly in California and in LA. There were others in other parts of the country, but very, very, very few. I think there was one Congress member from Texas, and it took a long time for this to really get going. But soon after I arrived here in California, things started happening. Even though you only had a handful in the state legislature, one of them, and I wanted to show this photo, named Richard Alatorre, was really a pivotal figure. And he was a pivotal figure. I can go as I talk about the various of these leaders, what they brought to this. Roybal ran first in 47, lost. When he went back and organized his community organizing with an organization that had an organizer that was lent to them by, people might know the name, Saul Alinsky, the Industrial Areas Foundation, paid for this organizer that helped build that organization that started just in a particular neighborhood called Boyle Heights. It's a famous East Side LA neighborhood. Organized.
You're describing the 50s, right? When this is happening.
Actually in the late 40s, because he runs the first time, loses. Back then, the LA City Council had 2-year terms. So he runs again in 49. And what happened was that his campaign operation became an organization called a Community Service Organization, or CSO. And it had a very able organizer that was lent by, that was financed by Saul Alinsky, the Industrial Areas Foundation. It grew into a statewide organization, but what they were doing is that they built a Latino electorate, first just right there in that district, that allowed Roybal, who didn't even make the runoff the first time, the second time in 49, he makes the runoff and he blows away the same incumbent, the incumbent that he lost to 2 years before. He just blows them out because they had registered something like 17,000 new voters. And in a single district, that's a lot, especially in 1949, right? But he's like the exception. He's like one vote out of 15 on the LA City Council. And then when he goes to Congress after the Kennedy election in 1960, and we have redistricting, we have new, actually additional districts. This is the first year that California does not grow its congressional delegation. It's actually losing a seat, but forever, all the way back to the beginnings of the state, it always grew. So he was able to run in 62, along with the sort of the spirit of the times, the Kennedy administration, and get elected to Congress. But then you didn't have a Latino on the LA City Council until the mid-1980s. And the one who did make it to the LA City Council had already started things really changing in California in 1980 because of his really close alliance. And this is a basic part of this story. Community organizing is one, but the other one is coalition building. Roybal had a multiracial coalition in Boyle Heights because it was the most diverse neighborhood in LA. Richard Alatorre, who got elected in the Nixon years to the state legislature, to the state assembly, had this really close bond with a very famous guy, Willie Brown, who was an assembly member as well from San Francisco. So they had what I like to call, because we haven't always thought, I don't think we've always thought about urban California. Well, this was an interurban alliance between a Chicano, a real Chicano. He was a real urban Chicano from the east side of LA, Alatorre, and Willie Brown, who was a civil rights lawyer when he got elected to the assembly in the early 60s. They formed a key bond. They formed a very tight bond. In fact, Alatorre lied on the tracks for Willie, and actually wound up paying the price for that, because it was the second time in 1980, following the 1980 election, that they're able to engineer Willie's successful bid to be Speaker of the Assembly. And that really started things changing. In fact, in tandem, because Roybal in Washington, as a member of Congress, was the main leader of the effort to get a change in the US Census, so that for the first time, you had a complete count to the Latino population in the 1980 census. And having that census, having that contribution that Roybal and many others, but I certainly consider him, and I describe it in the book this way, is the main person who leads census reform, enabled, when Willie Brown becomes Speaker of the California Assembly, he makes Richard Alatorre the head of the Reapportionment and Redistricting Committee. And that was when you started to see really an expansive redrawing of electoral districts all through California.
And why does
really
that matter, David? And why does that matter? I mean, you make some amazing points and observations about that turn from this period of the desert where Roybal is out there by himself,
right?
And then Alatorre and forms this alliance, and things change.
Mm-hmm.
Was that conscious? Was it organic?
It absolutely was. Roybal complained, he, I think even before he got to Congress, I think he complained in hearings in following the 1960 and 1970 census, that since you don't have the data, you're never going to draw a district that allows Latinos to elect representatives of their own choosing. And notoriously on the east side of LA, where you had a big concentration of people, but they were divided between those who lived within the city limits, like Boyle Heights, and those that lived outside the city limits, just across, they're right next to each other. People who are not from the east side probably don't know that East LA just refers to unincorporated East LA, outside of the Los Angeles city limits. It's unincorporated county. Now altogether, that was the biggest Latino population in the country, but they were really gerrymandered out of political existence. There was a time, that was just one of the things, but there was a time in which that area was split up among 7 legislative districts of different levels and at different kinds. And it's not until after you have to have the data. With the census reform, you had the first complete count, 1980, and you had an alliance in the assembly which controlled the drawing of districts that was going to allow for creating districts that not only right away Latinos might be able to run in and get elected, but that would also allow, really being farsighted about it, allow for growth over time. These were called sort of influence districts, that knowing the trends, actually consulting with the state experts on population trends, knowing that others would become competitive, that is, Latinos would become competitive in those districts. So things started really picking up. Roybal was the sole person from 1962 to 1982, and that goes from 1 to 3. It's a tripling in 1982 after that redistricting.
Yeah. And so, and I know we talked about it, the census was a big thing that Roybal was able to help engineer. And then with Alatorre and Willie Brown, the redistricting, which created the opportunities for Latinos to be able to, collectively get, raise their power and their ability to elect people. But there were some other things that are going on that you talked about. And it's not, as I understand from reading your book, it's not that people were always communicating, but there seemed to be a lot of things that were in play at the same time. The fact that you had redistricting is great, but you still have to get people who are willing to, become registered voters and then to turn out polls. And you talk in your book about what was going on, about the same time that would facilitate registrations and turnout. Can you talk some about that? Because it seems to me that's got to be very important too.
Sure, absolutely. And some of these elements, right, sort of like if you were to boil it down to like 5 basic elements that made it possible. Of course, you have population growth is happening, but population growth by itself doesn't translate into political power. The population had to be counted, the districts had to be created, but you also have to have candidates and you have to have campaigns and you have to have effective campaigns. And a big part of that, as I've already mentioned, were these multiracial, interracial coalitions. For Roybal and Boyle Heights, Boyle Heights had famously been a predominantly Jewish neighborhood before Mexicans started moving in big numbers, but it was very diverse. It had African-American population, some people actually quite famous, all the way up to, Will.i.am. He grew up, I mean, even as recently as someone as young as for us, Will.i.am grew up there and went to the same high school that Roybal went to, that a whole bunch of these people went to, Roosevelt High School. And he sponsors like 50 students graduating from Roosevelt every year to go to college. It's an amazing and an inspiring thing. Putting these had to be people, in order to build a coalition, you have to have people who are predisposed or who are willing to enter into that sort of a relationship. And it so happened that the Jewish population in that neighborhood was very lefty and politicized. I mean, like hyper politicized. They even tried to keep the most political active of the Jewish community there, tried to encourage their fellow co-ethnics, other Jewish Americans, from moving out as the Mexicans were moving in, because it was only in the late 1940s, you probably know this, that those restricted housing covenants were no longer legally enforceable. That was a 1948 Supreme Court decision. And not surprisingly, the Jewish population really starts to decline as they start moving out of that side of town. But a lot of key relationships came out of that. Tom Bradley, the record-setting mayor of Los Angeles, met his future campaign manager when they were both volunteering for one of the Roybal campaigns, right? In going all the way back to Roybal. With Alatorre, it is really impressive to me, and I only learned this a few years ago, and I incorporated it into a class that I teach, that for Alatorre, what really positioned him to get elected himself owed a lot to the fact that you had an Armenian population that had mobilized around the Armenian Holocaust. And there was a particular Armenian who got himself elected, already knew Roybal, and basically sponsored his first run. So you have all of these sort of things that are converging: population growth, census, redistricting, coalitions, community organizing. All of these things were really, I think, critical elements to this. One of the things that took a while, a bit in this story, is for when Latinas start getting elected. And that wasn't until 1982, when they tripled Latinos in the Congress. But you also had the first Latina, Gloria Molina. If I could show that fan of faces that I put together, Gloria Molina, who became not only the first Latina elected to the state legislature, to the state assembly, but also then followed Alatorre to the LA City Council, first Latina elected to the City Council, and then from there was the first Latina elected to the LA County Board of Supervisors. Now, to show you how far we've come, you remember in 1979 when I got to California, there's like practically nobody, right? I mean, there's just a handful of elected officials throughout the state. And Gloria Molina gets elected to in her first to the LA County Board of Supervisors in 1991. I do believe not only was she the first Latina, I think she was the first woman. Today, that's just a 5-member board, right? Most of these county boards are very small, with huge districts. All 5 are women, and the chair of the county board is a Latina, Hilda Solis, who is still to this day served at the highest level in U.S. government so far for a Latina. She was Secretary.
She was a labor secretary, right? For President Obama, right? So what is it that you think changed? I mean, we've talked about the structural things that allowed it, but there was a lot of work that was being done by labor that enabled some of these wins to occur, right? There was a lot of organizing of the community around education issues. Can you talk some about what is it that was really getting people mobilized to act once the path was laid for them to be able to, have the franchise
Well, one of
put
the
on?
interesting things that's very relevant, I think, to our times, and I did not know this. There's a lot here that I didn't know until I really researched it, and I keep learning all the time, is that one of the key things from the very beginning that motivated Ed Roybal way back in the 40s and in the 50s was police abuse. And the police abuse issue, because the organization that he founded, even when he was already on the city council, you had, before these terms were even coined, you had a practice of stop and frisk of especially young men of color, right? Both black and brown. And he had himself suffered abuse. And before anybody outside of the African-American community knew the terminology, the talk, Ed Roybal, as a member of the city council, had the talk with his daughters and told them, under no circumstances ever let a cop get you into a police car. And he was very explicit. He said to them, even if they tell you that I've been mortally wounded, I'm in the hospital and they want to take you there, do not get into a police car, because he had suffered abuse himself. There were savage beatings that were not at all uncommon. I don't know if you recall the movie L.A. Confidential.
Yes.
Do you remember that there is a scene? It's a historical scene. It actually happened. It was, and it's been referred to as Bloody Christmas, in which the police, LAPD, had rounded up mainly Latinos from something that was going on the East Side, a party or something like that. And they decided to have fun with them, and they made them run a gauntlet inside the police station, right? And just beat them bloody. They also wound up beating bloody the president of that organization, CSO. CSO, they used innovative tactics. This is another aspect of it, right? You have to have community organization, or you have to have organizations. You have to have a vehicle. But they use very innovative tactics. And for the first time ever, a whole bunch of police officers were reprimanded. Many of them were fired. I think 7 or 8 of them went up on charges and actually went to jail, were convicted. And so when they were trying to grow the organization, when they would go around and show people like the press clippings from the LA Times, right?
You're talking about CSO?
Yeah, CSO.
But everybody may not know what that is. What is the CSO?
Community Service Organization. And it's sort of like, for Latinos and in the Southwest, it's sort of like the granddaddy, so to speak, of the Industrial Areas Foundation style of organization. The IAF and Alinsky, they started in Chicago.
Right.
The back of the yards movement. And they were able to start organizations all over the place. Here, they just assisted the Latinos who were already mobilized around Roybal to form an organization. And that organization not only starts bringing benefits to the East Side, the basic services that were lacking, and this has been the story all over the country, but the police abuse issue was really the ticket. That's when this organizer that I've referred to was trying to start new chapters up and down the state, he discovers, in Hollywood terms, discovers Cesar Chavez, right, in San Jose, and discovers Dolores Huerta in Stockton. Both of them would say what sold them was to see, my God, you actually held cops accountable in LA. That they were just astounded by that.
What was the power of the CSO that anyone would care or pay attention? I mean, we've seen people protesting, just in the last year up and down the street, and it doesn't necessarily yield results. What was different? What was the source of the power for the CSO?
They're on several different levels, but the first thing that you would have to say, once they're able to do it, they always their starting priority was voter registration. If they could change the electorate, if they could create really a Latino electorate where none really existed, then that would be the way to get elected officials' attention. And that's how, you know, Roybal got elected, even though he was a lonely one-person vote for, I think, the entire time he was on the city council for 13 years. And then he was the only representative of California in Congress until 1982, right? When you get some others. But registration and voting. But they also use these other very, I think, very astute, innovative tactics in order to make people aware of what was going on. And in a way, they almost seem to have, it almost seemed like they knew intuitively how to do this. I'll tell you another little anecdote, and this is still focusing all at the beginning. I'm actually working on the volume 2 that brings us all the way up to this year, right? But Roybal, when he got elected in 1949, his wife had wanted them to move to a better house, and in relation to the fact he was a World War II era veteran. He didn't see combat. He just served stateside. He didn't enter until 1945. But he used that as part of his being able to get elected. He gets elected in 1949. Here in LA, the normal date at which elected officials take office is July the 1st. Mm-hmm. And I believe that year, the 4th of July might have been a Monday. But he had been told that even though it was no longer enforceable, that they were not, some housing development were not selling to Mexicans. And not only to, you know what that means, right? So right. Mexicans, anybody of color. Maybe they had dropped the prohibition or the discrimination against the Jewish community by then, but they hadn't yet on this. So he goes sees a house. He has in his pocket the down payment, right? And so he makes an offer on the house, and the realtor, if he had that status, says to him, "I'm sorry, if I can't sell to a Mexican, my boss won't let me sell to a Mexican," and said to him, to Roybal, "If you just claim to be Spanish or Italian, I could sell this to you." And Roybal, according to the stories of the way he put it, he didn't say anything. He just gave him his card because he had gotten his city council business cards. He just gave him his card, turned around, went to his car. The guy looks at the card and then, oh my gosh, this guy's a member of the LA City Council, goes running after him and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. And please, this is all you have to do." And Roybal just drives away. It forms like his first speech, I think, in the city council, that because the first day that after taking office, that he was able to give a speech. But CSO also started a picket outside that real estate office. So they were able to right away, right, in 1949, right away, they were able to knock down housing discrimination in several neighborhoods on the east side. So yeah. That's just part of, and then when they took on the LAPD, they did a bunch of really innovative things that got a lot of attention. They got a lot of attention in the papers, on the radio, and you even had TV already. That was already in the 1950s. But Roybal was so had such a bad relationship with the LAPD. He would sometimes even wear a bulletproof vest. He actually thought that not only were LAPD cops capable of doing something to his family or to him, or setting someone up against him, that he actually had to go that far. And it's remarkable. To me, it's remarkable to find how deep these things are, how far back they go.
Yeah, and it is interesting because every time I listen to you talk about Roybal and read more about him, I mean, he really was a lone soldier for a long time, and was sometimes writing the playbook because there wasn't necessarily a roadmap that had been laid out for him. And then you fast forward, and not only do you have more people becoming really active in the space, but sometimes you have people actually competing against each other to try to hold office. And I think it's interesting, at least the way you outlined it, sometimes they were foes, but other times they were friends. And it's like that maximum, I have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. So how did that play out when you had, some of these people on your list, these esteemed folks, didn't always play well together?
That's right. I mean, Roybal starts with Boyle Heights. The next neighborhood to get organized was East LA proper itself. That is the census designated place, unincorporated part of LA County called East LA. And a whole other leader who rose up through labor, Esteban Torres, through the UAW. He has quite a story himself. I mean, he was born, I'll get emotional if I say this too closely. Of course, the opening lines of Change is Going to Come.
Yes.
Esteban Torres was born in a tent in a mining town in Arizona. And when his mother brought him to LA, his father was deported and never heard from again. That was in the 1930s. When he came to LA, he said it was like a miracle to him. He'd never had indoor plumbing, hot water when you want it, right? You don't have to go outside to go to the bathroom. Anyway, Esteban Torres, who should have and could have been an artist, he is an artist, but that was not how he could support himself in a family. Went to work in a auto factory on the east side in Maywood, or what was called the Maywood plant, and always continued making his art. He wound up rising through. Here again, it was multi-ethnic, multiracial. It was the real Jewish radicals that had been banned from any position within the UAW that pushed Esteban to run for shop steward, and he just rose, and he rose to where he became like the top official in the UAW for the hemisphere, right? That is for Latin American relations, the Western region of the US and Latin America. His union sends him essentially back to East LA in 1968 to start an organization that's called Telecu, the East Los Angeles Community Union. And so he organizes that neighborhood with the East Los Angeles Community Union, even tried to get it incorporated as a city. Fails at that. He is the one who, after all of that experience, again comes back after serving in the Carter administration, comes back to LA and runs for Congress in 1982 and gets elected, joins Roybal. But for the longest time, Roybal, one thing is good, right, is that there are different places where you can create a power base. Roybal had his in Boyle Heights. Esteban Torres had his in East LA. But Roybal didn't think very much of these guys in East LA. And in 1982, the same year that Torres gets elected to Congress, Gloria Molina is running against a candidate who is really supported. She is supported by women that she has mobilized into a new organization, a Chicana feminist organization called Comisión Femenil. And she has to run against a guy who later becomes very important, Richard Polanco, in 1982, who is supported by Alatorre and a lot of the guys on the east side. So there was that sort of a competition that I think that also drew out. It can sometimes be destructive, but sometimes it actually can fuel competitive sorts of mobilization that further this.
That's one of my favorite parts of the story is when the women rise up and Latinas claim their rightful place, and I just think that's an amazing story. But even when you recount it, we're still only talking about a couple of people that you've highlighted that were Latina. And is there something different about a different dynamic when it comes to women who are part of this transformation versus when you're talking about men, either in terms of their journey or outcomes?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I'm sure there's more than I even know, because the first book really only has among the 10 real principal characters, but there are others besides the 10. There's only 2 Latinas among the 10 that were those sorts of historic characters, but there was another, especially another one that's part of the story that's in there, that's a big part of the Latina mobilization on the east side. But you had Gloria Molina, You had this other labor leader who's now in the state Senate, Marilena Durazo. And you also, very importantly, had Antonia Hernandez, who headed the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund for many years. But before Antonia, she was just out of UCLA Law School. Before she became part of MALDEF, that came years later. In the 1970s, she was working for this legal services organization. It was, I forget exactly what it's called, but it was one of those that were started during the Great Society, War and Poverty years in the 1960s under Johnson, when a doctor comes to her from county hospital, the famous county USC General Hospital, right? The one that people who ever watch soap operas have an image in their head, about how the doctors there, those that were the OBGYN doctors that were delivering babies, were pressuring women of color to be sterilized while they were in labor. So this one doctor, he was a new doctor. He had come down from Oakland. He had observed this before, and he did his own investigation, and he found over 180 women that had been sterilized, and there was no consent form in their file. He takes this to Antonia Hernandez and this legal aid organization. Antonia takes it on, as she's going to do. This is going to be her first case, right? There's going to be a class action suit. She goes to the east side, finds Gloria Molina and her group, her organization, Comisión Femenil Mexicana, and says, I need you, because they needed an organizational plaintiff for a class action suit. That was really a historic battle, even though they don't win their case. There's a great documentary about that case, about that whole experience, and other stuff that's been published about it. They don't win the case, but they win a change in policy, so that you no longer had women, Black and brown women, being pressured to be sterilized when they're in the midst of labor, right? It's like,
yeah.
Very
and I thought it was important. You talked some about this, about how important having that voice was, because when I think it was Now got involved, which was largely a white feminist organization, and there was, if I'm right, it was Now.
Yes. Yeah.
And there was a clash over some of the relief that the two organizations were seeking. So can you talk about that? I found that a fascinating study, and it's, consistent with some criticism that has been made about the feminist movement and how it is or is not representative of Black and brown community.
Yeah, it's really a remarkable thing, because sometimes you hear in vague terms about there not being, necessarily great relations between essentially the white feminist movement and women of color, right? And here's a very, very specific case, because from the point of view of Gloria Molina, Antonia Hernandez, Comisión Femenil, what had to happen was the decision to give consent, if it is consent at all, had to be delinked from the experience of labor. A woman in labor is under some stress, a significant stress, and is susceptible to being pressured by a doctor, right? So in trying to delink that, one of the demands of the lawsuit was that consent be given before labor, not in the midst of labor, right? That would mean delinking in time. That would mean some sort of advance warning and some period of time between giving consent and actually and labor and performing the sterilization. Well, to the National Organization for Women, who testified to this, there were hearings that were held up and down the state on this issue. They feared that sort of delinking in time between consent and the performance of sterilization undermined sterilization on demand. And for them, that would be a precedent, a harmful precedent with regard to abortion, right? I mean,
Right.
those who are against abortion to this day, right? We see it all over the country, have argued for waiting periods and a delay and all sorts of things. In some states, I think they're requiring a woman who wants an abortion performed has got to be shown the what is it called, the sound,
The sonogram.
the sonogram
Right.
of the fetus before the abortion is performed. So they were trying to protect abortion rights, reproductive rights, and for them that included sterilization, and the sterilization should be on demand, and there should be no waiting period. But the Chicanas who were part of this lawsuit felt, you don't get it, right? I mean, we're literally hundreds of women have been sterilized without consent.
Right. And so it wasn't even a matter of that they were giving consent in a difficult time. In many instances, they weren't giving consent at all.
Yeah.
It was just being done. And yeah, you have one question, David. You mentioned that there was a documentary on this whole, I guess, the lawsuit and the sterilization cases themselves. Do you have the name of it?
Yeah, I believe that's the documentary. The title is in Spanish. I could look it up to make sure I'm not getting it wrong. No más bebés, no more babies. And that it wasn't that long ago, so it's something that you can easily find on the web and probably even actually also see like on YouTube or on PBS, because it was on PBS.
Yeah. So we talked some about the role that women have played in this great transformation, but I think it would be very interesting to talk about some of the impacts that this whole movement has made, and some things that have been able to be accomplished as a result of really a mass mobilization of a community that previously had not had any representation to speak of.
Yes, well, a bunch of reforms that I've already alluded to. I mean, reforming the census was a big deal. Getting redistricting done differently so that communities can elect their own representatives of their own choosing, was another big deal. There are other sorts of reforms, like the reform at County Hospital with regard to the performance of and informed consent for the performance of sterilization is another change.
And I think I was also thinking about the education piece. I mean, you were telling the story about what happened as a result of having people in elected office, what they were able to do to improve access and outcomes in education, just because they were part of the discussion rather than on the outside looking in.
And that has also various parts that fit in together, because I went all the way back to the beginning with CSO and how the CSO organizer finds Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, brings them to LA. That's where they learn organizing. They both decide to leave in the early 1960s to start the United Farm Workers Union, which they succeed in doing. And that's another layer of this empowerment story of building a Latino electorate, not just in LA, but statewide. Well, education is often pointed to as the beginning of the Chicano movement as a whole, in particular in 1968, when something like 10 to 15,000 Chicano students walked out of their high schools in a very brief period of time. It was the biggest coordinated, I think still is, public school walkout in US history. And that threw the gigantic school district into crisis. But that happened during and towards the end of the first hunger strike, the first fast that Cesar Chavez undertook. I think it was like a 25-day fast in February of 1968. He had been fasting for several weeks already when the students walk out. And the main teacher, who's been credited as being a big influence on a lot of these students at Lincoln High School, a guy named Sal Castro, said that he conveyed to the students, but he would also say, when the students saw that farm workers could walk off the field, which they did for the strike in the fields in the 1960s, they felt they could walk out of They're very unequal and inadequate schools. So that's part of what happened. And that's part of, I mean, a lot of these leaders like Roybal, like Alatorre, like Richard Polanco, can tell you stories about what they felt was a very inadequate education that they got from the LA public schools. Alatorre, even before he was able to do the redistricting reform and get Willie Brown, work with Willie Brown so that Willie Brown becomes the Speaker of the Assembly from 1980 to 1994, Willie Brown was already a major figure in the Assembly, and he chaired Ways and Means. And he brought Alatorre, when he just started, onto his committee and gave Alatorre, who had taught college level at UC Irvine and I forget someplace, Cal State Long Beach, made him head of the Education Committee. Well, what Ways and Means can do is essentially make real the budget as is requested by the governor, right? Or they can pencil some things out. And Alatorre decided he was going to use the power that he had heading this committee. And it started, I believe it started with what was then called Bolt Law School at UC Berkeley.
Right.
In which Alatorre had hearings, and he had the heads of the dean of Bolt Law School for UC Berkeley, but he also did this in relation to UC Irvine and UC Riverside, their professional schools. One of the first questions he would ask them when they were going over the budget was, what are you doing about Chicano and Black admissions? And they would all resist. And he would say, okay. The next thing they knew, when the budget came out for higher ed out of the committee, Alatorre had penciled out administrative salaries. Everything went through, no administrative salary. And in one case after the other, the school authorities came back to Alatorre with an affirmative action plan within a week or 2 weeks at most, whether if it was Bolt, or it was because UC Irvine wanted a teaching hospital, or Riverside wanted an agricultural extension building. He said that he came to understand that these trophy items for these prestigious UC system universities were really a source of leverage for him. He wouldn't have to pass a law. He was using the budget for leverage, and very intelligently.
The great story, the carrot and the stick.
That's right.
You have another question here, David, and I'm going to encourage anyone who has questions, please be sure to put them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that David gets them. The question is, given the importance of urban coalitions, would splitting California into 2 states, as is sometimes suggested, have an impact on the power shift and success of coalitions in statewide elections?
Well, if that was to be looked at historically, if California was divided between North and South, you wouldn't have had the interurban LA San Francisco coalition between Alatorre and Willie Brown, right? So that would not be a positive thing. And as we've talked in preparation for this conversation, one of the things that distinguishes California from Texas, Mexican Americans in Texas used to be way ahead of Latinos in California in terms of office holdings. And now they're practically frozen out of statewide politics because you had a complete Republican takeover of Texas. There's not a single Democrat elected statewide in Texas. And it's, well, they're trying to keep it that way, right? Through the things that they're doing about voter participation. And one of the things that didn't happen, you didn't have the sort of coalitions in Texas. Actually, you could say this has partly to do with the fact that most of the Mexican American population in Texas lives in a different part of the state from most of or has historically, the African American population in Texas. So there's been some distinction there, but you just didn't have the sort of relationships and coalitions in Texas that came about in California. I think here there's several other things that are obviously involved. We've talked about labor. We've talked about ethnic diversity. We haven't mentioned the LGBTQ community, which we used to just simply call the gay community, right? Now, this is something that it's very interesting to see what sorts of stereotypes really don't withstand scrutiny about Latinos. One of them is this notion of, Latino machismo. They must be not only subordinating women, but also would be very homophobic, right? But Alatorre was the first politician in running for office in 1971 and 1972 for the state assembly from the east side of the city of Los Angeles City, the first one who openly campaigned to attract the gay vote. It so happened that his campaign manager just happened upon to discover that there was a concentration of gay voters and households in that district, and Alatorre ran away with it. In fact, his successful campaign manager, he also lost his first campaign. The second one was just months later, because the first time it was for a special election. The second one says it wasn't Latinos that elected Alatorre, it was the gay vote that actually rescued Alatorre. When you look at that, and that was because Alatorre was so tight with Willie Brown, and Willie Brown was the sponsor of the #1 priority legislation for the gay community, which was called the Consenting Adults Bill, right? Back in the 1970s. But when you look at something else, like say in the area of health, but also how health is obviously subject to all sorts of political conditioning, Roybal was the sponsor of the first bill to fund HIV/AIDS research in Congress. And it's also a Latino politician who did the same thing in the state legislature in California.
And so, and a lot of the stories that you tell would suggest that most of these politicians, and not all of them, would fit into what we today call the progressive side of politics, and are Democrats. But you also mentioned that Reagan's famous quote about Hispanics are Republican, they just don't know it yet.
Yeah.
I guess you would take maybe exception with that, but let's talk about what you've talked about as a Latino political paradox. What is that, and what do you mean when you talk about that?
And I think there are actually two paradoxes here. But the first one is that when you look at Latinos, the vast majority of Latinos, not all, obviously, the vast majority of Latinos in the US are really those who are the immigrants themselves, but they are either immigrants themselves or they're descended from immigrants, their parents or their grandparents, predominantly from rural and small town Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. We didn't have really significant urban migration to the US from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, with the exception of Cuba, obviously, for very different reasons, for the Cuban Revolution. You really didn't have urban migrants coming to the United States. So if their background and if their roots are rural, small town, if you know these countries, Mexico, Central America, and in the Caribbean, especially in Mexico and Central America, those small towns tend to be pretty conservative. The Catholic Church tends to be like a really, really important institution. Often the priest, the pastor of the church, is the most powerful person for social and political purposes in town, not necessarily the wealthiest person in town. But so you might expect that between those origins and Catholicism and the stereotypically large families, right? Other things that Reagan was aware of, because Reagan had his ranch in Santa Barbara and he filmed Westerns. He was in Westerns that were shot on location in Mexico. And supposedly he said that Ronald and Nancy Reagan's favorite food was Mexican food, right? So they had what they knew about Mexican people were as people who took care of their horses and their ranch, and did their cooking and did their cleaning, and they knew about these families that have altars in their own home with candles in front of saints, representations of saints and crucifixes and whatnot, and thought, well, here these people are obviously very culturally conservative, and when you think about, they can handle guns and they can handle horses, they should be Republicans, right? And that probably is not irrelevant to notoriously in the last election in South Texas along the border. Trump made some gains there, but this is not foreign to our understanding also of the African-American political experience, is that you have to wonder if the background is really pretty conservative, why is the politics not conservative? Why are they part of, and as I mentioned in one of our conversations, why are Latinos part of the Obama coalition, right? And now the Biden coalition. And in fact, you know who beat Biden with the Latino vote in the primaries last year? It was Bernie Sanders, right? I mean, hardly a conservative guy. And one of the things, and this was a whole other project that I coordinated, that we found is that, yes, it's true, you can find poll data to support that Latinos in cultural terms are somewhat more conservative than the average on abortion, on sexuality, right? And in terms of, their faithfulness, in terms of their religion, and those sorts of things. But what they don't do is turn those relatively conservative cultural values, they don't turn them into policy priorities. When you ask them about the policy priorities, and the project that I coordinated had over 50 focus groups of local leaders all across the country. When you ask them about policy priorities, they never bring up abortion or some attitude with regard to gay rights. They bring up schools and education, jobs. They bring up the environment, right? That's also not stereotypically what we would associate with minority voters. They actually do respond in surveys, place a greater priority on environmental issues than the average American. And that's because of the sorts of neighborhoods that they've lived in. The answer to this question is that I think it's consummately the urban experience for both African Americans and for Latinos. The urban setting is I call it the crucible, right, for the formation of a political outlook that is very focused on these sorts of, you could call them bread and butter issues, right? Basic issues. Even when you take into account that Latinos, in particular those of Mexican and Central American origin, have a particular interest in immigration as an issue. But often immigration is down the list from a lot of these other basic education, transportation, housing.
Yeah, because what you're describing are basic human rights issues that people tend to value when the consequence of not valuing it is that you're placed in a position of subjugation, of oppression, or whatever. And so you're talking about political power as a counterweight to all of those things, and being able to take some control over your own narrative. I'm going to combine a couple of questions and ask you about this, and your book talks about it. In many instances, a lot of the progress that's been made, the activism and the Latino community was informed by what was going on in the civil rights movement, including training and mentoring that took place. And so there's a question about whether or not, with the situation that's happening with Asian American communities being subjected to hate crimes and violence, do you see there being some coalition opportunities around Latino and Asian American activism?
Absolutely. I mean, and this has already been there. And I would really recommend to people, maybe some of the people tuning in know our schoolmate, not from our class, she's much younger than we are, Vanessa Tyson, who's got a terrific book on the formation of what's called the Tri-Caucus in the US Congress. The Tri-Caucus combines the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the AAPI caucus. And the tri-caucus has become a power, right? And I'm sure Vanessa has probably done these sorts of events as well, because it's a terrific book, and I cite it in mine. Hers came out before that. And that's just one example in which they are working together. One of the leaders of the AAPI caucus and delegation in Congress, Judy Chu, from the San Gabriel Valley of LA County, she's absolutely part of this story, right? She would not have been elected without really strong Latino support. She was supported by especially Latina and Latino-led labor, as well as who became, our sort of biggest breakthrough locally was when Antonio Villaraigosa became mayor of LA, right? Antonio Villaraigosa and Marilena Durazo, who pulled off a revolution within her labor union local in LA, really put the muscle behind getting Judy Chu into Congress. And she's a very important person. Now, if you look back here, just recent events, this year's events in California, we had, and I had missed explaining what I was going to say. What is it that is to be explained right now? Is how have Latinos gotten where they are now, right? Where there's now a record 4 Latinos in the cabinet, Biden's cabinet, and 3 of the 4 are from LA, right? One of them, Javier Becerra, who's the new Secretary of Health and Human Services. He came out of being California Attorney General. He was appointed Attorney General and then elected, but appointed to serve out the term of Kamala Harris when Kamala Harris was elected to the Senate. And now that Javier Becerra has joined the administration, we have the first ever Asian American Attorney General in California history, Rob Bonta. He's out of the California Assembly. All of these people know each other, and all of them, not always, but all of them, most of the time, are really pretty close allies. Bonta immediately put an emphasis on a new unit within the California Department of Justice, especially on hate crimes. So that is happening, and it's part of the mix. The way these things are so intertwined, right? Kamala Harris moves on from San Francisco DA to the state attorney general, to the U.S. Senate, to vice president, the first vice president. Most remarkable about that, not only had there never been a California Democrat in the White House, either as president or VP, had never even been on the ticket. You had never had a candidate in November, a Democratic candidate from California for either position of president or vice president. She is so many firsts all at once. Well, if Javier Becerra succeeded her as Attorney General, who succeeded her as senator is Alex Padilla. And Alex Padilla was inaugurated, who was sworn into office. That's one of the photos I would like to show. He was sworn into office wearing his face mask, along with the 2 new senators from Georgia. This is all part, I would say, really is part of a remarkable empowerment movement. And so that's the other paradox. The first paradox is, how is it that people who really come from culturally conservative backgrounds, how do they become part of the progressive political coalition in the United States today? The other one is, if we've had such, and we did, I would show more images to illustrate this. If we had really the most extraordinary and threatening and damaging backlash to immigration and to Latino advancement and to the priorities of people of color in general over the last 4+ years with the Trump election and the Trump presidency, how is it that we're in this remarkable place right now with a record 4 Latinos in the cabinet, and in LA, the mayor, the president of the city council, the chief of police, the county sheriff, the head of the school board, the new DA, the new progressive DA in LA, they're all Latino. We are in, and it was, as I mentioned to you, a city council member, Gilbert Cedillo, made this point in an interview that I had with him a couple of weeks ago. we're in this extraordinary Latino moment in LA, and I had to add, and in the country, right? When you look at the cabinet, the thing to know about this, which I knew it, everybody would know it if you just think about it, but it just hadn't gelled in my mind, is that when a community, and certainly in the Latino experience, when they have had reason to mobilize, essentially what I call the politics of resistance, resistance against sterilization at county hospital, resistance against Proposition 187, which barred public services to undocumented residents of California in the 1990s, resistance to Trump. The major elements of the resistance to Trump were communities of color, women, and the state of California, right?
So the, you know, with the playbook that's been used, and I guess there are many chapters to that playbook, but what's been used in California, is that something that can be replicated in other places around the state? Do you see that happening when it comes to organizing, mobilizing the Latino community politically?
Well, it's amazing how even just within LA County, how it was extended, right? It starts on the east side. It starts in one neighborhood. You add another neighborhood, East LA, to Boyle Heights, but then you have the San Fernando Valley, where Alex Padilla is from. You have Orange County. You have within LA the southeast cities. So we have seen ongoing expansion. The biggest, most dramatic, most consequential expansions that, I'm sure that some people might take exception to LA and Latinos in California claiming any credit for this, but it happens to be the case that these LA-based actors and vehicles of empowerment, like Latino-led labor, were a big part of changing where Nevada falls in presidential elections, right? And it started with Obama. So now it's not as novel. Most recently, just last November, Arizona. LA and Latinos in California had a very significant influence on Arizona in stimulating mobilization, voter registration, voting in Arizona. And the terms of the debate in states like Arizona, and today and for years now in states like Texas, is we don't want to become like California, right? They're resisting it. It's interesting that LA actors and organizations were involved in Georgia, right? I mean, that was another case in which you practically nationalized what was going on in Georgia.
So and I'm sure that you were aware that when it came to the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, Kamala's presence on the ballot was very motivating for members of the Black community, particularly Black women, who were organized already in existing communities like sororities and the Divine Nine, sororities and fraternities, organizations like the Links, which have national and international presence and relationships. And they were very successful in mobilizing Black women to turn out to vote. Do you have some of these umbrella organizations that can be tapped into, or are being tapped into similarly in the Latino community?
Yeah, I think that it's a part of the basics of how to advance politically is working in coalition. You have to work in coalition, and then there are entities like, and I referred earlier to the book of Vanessa Tyson's about the formation of the Tri-Caucus, and as she puts it in there, that what she saw herself and was able to include in what she examines in the book is that top congressional leadership had even gotten used to asking, well, where's the Tri-Caucus on this issue, right? No longer having to break it down. We were talking before, which I find remarkable, and you seem to agree in preparation for this, that I've never heard so often when there is discussions, whether it has to do with a pandemic, whether it has to do with questions of racial justice. I've never heard so many African-American people and activists and leaders say black and brown. I mean, we're hearing black and brown all the time, and it became sort of inescapable, especially because of the pandemic. The costs were have been and continue to be so disproportionate on these communities. It's just astonishing, and it's become undeniable that there's so many shared conditions that people are struggling with. And there's so many shared priorities that they almost obviously would be better off advancing together.
So there's another question which I think picks up where you're leaving off here, which is that given that Republicans continue to foment culture wars, do you think they will make inroads into the Latino community, or will they cause Latinos to focus more closely on bread and butter issues?
Will Republicans continue to focus on culture wars?
I think that's the setup, is that there's this continued focus on culture wars. Do you think that will allow them to make inroads into the Latino community, or will it actually have a different effect, which will cause them to focus more closely on bread and butter issues? I hope that I'm doing that question justice.
It's very uneven, and actually, now that I can see the questions, I have to give a shout out to my old friend Frank Ayala, who was such an important administrator in our days there, and we
all want to say hello to Frank. Hey, Frank.
Right, great to have you join in. It's very uneven. I was just looking at the numbers yesterday. I think that yes, the Trump campaign advanced marginally, but advanced with African-American men and Latino men, more men than women. But this is very uneven and in different places. Amongst Latinos, that mainly happened very locally in Florida and in South Texas. And there's so much else that's going on there. But when you look at the fact that if you look at California, where you have had institutionalized these coalitions and achieved power, right? Actually have institutional power. Trump lost worse last November in California among everyone, and among Latinos as well. Made no inroads at all in California. And back in 2016, the state that most rejected Trump and supported Hillary was Hawaii, and California was second, right? In this past election, California took the lead. So there was no advance whatsoever on the basis of that approach. So there's a lot of really interesting things. I'm contributing a chapter to another book comparing, and I'm not done comparing California and Texas, having originally been from Texas, but having lived in California all this time. And I think there's so much there that we can learn in making those contrasts, in understanding how those came about. The short answer for what happened in Texas was that George W. Bush, he was a Republican who was very Latino friendly, or Hispanic friendly, as I like to say, in Texas. He really helped Republicans take over that state. But under his friendly face leadership, right? They didn't go, extreme until after he was out of the picture. And now he denounces the party himself. He says, there's all sorts of bad things about him. But unfortunately, he was able to help them get a lock in that state. So it really depends on place.
Well, here's another question for you, David. Have you read Manuel Pastor's State of Resistance, What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Mean for America's Future? And if so, how would you say they complement each other or are different?
There's a whole story there. I often credit Manuel Pastor, an old friend of mine, that I learned to teach, mainly working with him at Occidental College, Occidental post-Obama. Even though Obama was already gone, he transferred to Columbia, and we were there after he even had graduated from Columbia. but a lot of our old colleagues at Occidental, Oxy as they call it, remembered Barry really well. I mean, one of them, an English teacher there named Eric Newhall, he used to actually even play basketball with Obama. Always wondered why Obama didn't try out for the actual school team. He only played, you know, sort of intramural and pickup sort of stuff. But anyway, Manuel Pastor and I are old friends. I told him I worked on this book way too long. I told him about this book certainly by 2010. And he was enthusiastic about it. He had not yet come up with the idea for his book. and if you I can certainly follow up. Anybody would like to see that on the Facebook 1970 class of 79 page, and the Latino alumni page or group page. I put in a whole bunch of things, including a link to a sample of the book. And you get there, you know, the blurbs that open a book that say praise for the book. That's the first one there is Manuel Pastor's, right? So our books are sort of like interwoven with each other. He wound up taking the large view, whereas mine is on the specifically the Latino-centric part of this story. But there's a tremendous amount of overlap there.
Well, you have a real fan, David. Alyssa says she looks forward to reading your book and sharing it with others, and she thanks you for the added stories. This is a question that was asked earlier. I want to see if you have anything to add to it, whether, you know, what is or are the most effective national organizations in the area of Latino voter registration and Latinos in politics.
There's well, it's easier to answer the second one because you get a certain impression from Latino organizations that do more than one thing. And one of the ones, like in the book that I'm working on now, which is volume 2 of Power Shift, the one of the new organizations that actually helped probably more than 30 Latinas, especially Latinas and Latinos, get elected last November is called the Latino Victory Project, which divides into two things. It's the Latino Victory Fund, which is a PAC. It raises money and it gives money, headed by this tremendous Latino from LA who moved out of LA a long time ago, but had a tremendous early career in LA, Natalie Reyes. So I would look to the Latino Victory Fund overall in terms of like actually getting people elected. At the more base level, we have a number of organizations. There are those that are based in labor, like well, and there are a number of them that that engage in voter registration. I would call attention to one of the organizations that was founded by Ed Roybal back in the 1970s, which is the NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. They have been very active, and they're a very good source of data, of information on Latino electeds, and they actually do profiles of the Latino electorate for every key state in every key electoral cycle. There have been any number of other organizations like the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, which was another case of Latinos emulating something that was pioneered by African Americans, the Voter Registration Project that took place in the South. Could probably think of several more, but among those that I think need to be mentioned in the overall scheme of things, and that play a major part both in the existing book and in the new book. One of the things,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, one of the things also pioneered by African American elected officials was coming together and acting collectively as electeds, right? The formation of the Congressional Black Caucus, which was followed 2 or 3 years later by the formation of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And the Hispanic Caucus has been an important entity in when it decides to get behind, like say someone new who is running in in a district where you haven't had Latino representation before. When they get behind that, that can make a difference. And they also can make a difference in terms of policy, right? It's equivalent. That actually was founded first in California, which is the California Latino Legislative Caucus, is big, right? I mean, in California, the combination of all of these forces have led to California having what the current Speaker of the Assembly calls giga majorities in the California legislature. The Latino Legislative Caucus is a very important entity for purposes of both moving policy, legislation, but also in helping people get elected. And that was something that was really pioneered by one of the leaders that I mentioned before very quickly, Richard Polanco, when he served like a record, like maybe a dozen years as chair of the Latino. He changed it from Chicano to Latino Legislative Caucus. And this is another thing that if we'd not had the benefit of the fact that Willie Brown's family left Texas, where they had been sharecroppers, and came to California, so that Willie grew up in San Francisco and became a lawyer, right? And then ultimately Speaker of the State Assembly. Willie as Speaker, as powerful and as demanding and as forceful as he was, and gotta love him, he gave me a very long interview, and I really appreciated that for the first book. He allowed for Polanco, as the head of the Latino caucus, to actually back candidates against the candidates that the Speaker was backing, right? As long as Polanco met his quota of what you were supposed to raise funds for the Democratic caucus as a whole, Willie let him go ahead and sponsor his own Latino candidates in races where Willie wasn't even on the same page. So that sort of comity, right, of working out the relationship and allowing for synergies, I think has just been an essential part of the story.
Well, it's going to be very interesting, given that we are now having to deal with redistricting again based on the decennial census. And of course, there is the rash of laws that are changing voter registration, voter participation, voter issues of voter suppression, questions of voter suppression, all that is happening now. It would be interesting to see what your observations are once we get through this time, and how it may or may not have impacted some of the things we've talked about today. California looks like may lose a congressional seat, maybe two. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Is it one seat?
One seat. I mean, I think the Census Bureau itself already did the math, and it's not. There is, according to the state finance department, California actually did shrink in 2020, but we don't know how much of that is due simply to COVID, to the pandemic, and to the shutdown. But California did still grow, not as much proportionately as other states, certainly not as much as Texas, which picked up seats. And California really invested, like I think over $180 million to get people to fill out the census, to participate in the census, so that we wouldn't wind up like New York, that lost a congressional seat. If 90 more people had participated in the census, New York wouldn't have lost that seat. But yes, we definitely did lose a seat, and this is creating really wreaking havoc, to use that cliche, on the coming electoral cycle, because the data is late. The data has still not been delivered to the states so that they can actually draw districts.
Right.
So unless you're like really powerful and you can get your way and you're in a state in which it's still a political process, it's not here, it's done by an independent commission. They don't know what their districts look like. There are incumbents in office now who can't be sure that they'll still live in the district after the district lines are drawn or redrawn. And there are new candidates that don't know where exactly they need to live in order to run in a particular district yet.
Well, David, I'm being given the sign that we're going to have to begin wrapping it up. So I want to end with this, maybe one question and one very short question, but this is the first one. Thank you for recognizing the leadership role African Americans have played in the ways that we Latinos have made gains by emulating and working together in solidarity with African Americans and others. And maybe we can end it by asking, is the empowerment that we've been describing, how does that relate to or explain the appointment of our own Justice Sonia Sotomayor to the Supreme Court?
Well, that was terrific. I honestly don't think, you could even go so far as to say that if you hadn't had some strategic Latino support for Obama, that if you remember the primary campaign of 2008, right, really went a long way, right? I mean, it was long and drawn out, and some of the gains that Obama was able to pick up, Latinos played a role in that, and you had significant Latino supporters like Maria Elena Durazo, the head of her union, which had all of this influence, still has all this influence over the culinary workers in Las Vegas. That was really important for Obama, and that's why she had real stroke in the Obama administration, and several others did as well, especially Latinas that endorsed Obama, like Maria Elena, like the previous head of MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Vilma Martinez, endorsed Obama, like the newspaper. I didn't mention Spanish language media is a big part of this story. The daily newspaper, still there in LA, La Opinión, endorsed Obama. I think that it was no coincidence, I make this point in the book, that Sonia's nomination to the Supreme Court and Vilma Martinez's nomination to be U.S. ambassador to Argentina, I think came within 3 days of each other. And this is something that if, you don't have to have worked in government or in politics to know this. If you just watch The West Wing, you know that there are periods, whole weeks where really are defined. They have a message calendar that they're trying to make a particular sort of point. I mean, the Trump White House did the same thing, and they had their Hispanic week last year. It was rather embarrassing, really, for some people. But the fact that Sonia Sotomayor and Vilma Martinez nominations were announced within days of each other can't have been a coincidence. That was part of delivering a message and delivering really to the coalition that took him to power. And he, the first Democratic president to win over 50% twice since FDR.
Well, David, it's been great. And again, I'm just so pleased to have been asked to participate with you. And I'm looking forward to your second book. I see Marguerite has entered the room.
Come on in, Marguerite. You're muted. You can't unmute? Can't unmute. We've had some technical issues. So sorry about that. Thank you so much, Marguerite. Thank you so much.
And to all the participants who were able to join us, thank you. It was so nice to see familiar names and also to see some new faces. Thank you for your kind comments, David. You're being greatly complimented, and I want to join in adding my praise to the work that you've done and the impact that you're making. It's been great fun. Thank you to everybody.
The host allowed me to unmute just now. So thank you, David and Donna, for an extremely interesting and enlightening conversation. I wish we could all head out to a reunion tent right now to continue talking next year. Everybody, you're welcome to join us at the 79's Family Zoom room at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time to listen to Lauren Taslitz, who will share music from her new musical, Mimosa, and a premiere song by Terry Silverlight. Tomorrow morning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the Authors and Artists series presentation, Love and Death, Writing Genre Fiction, a conversation with Nancy Harkness, our classmate, and Lucy Burdett, also known as Roberta Islib, class of 75. This session is open to all, so you're welcome to join us. And at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, it's the P-Raid, and our own Gary King will moderate. So please join us for the rest of the festivities for Reunions 2021. And if you need links to any of these, or you want to have some, David or Donna keep in touch, send your emails in the Q&A. We will keep it open for a few more minutes. Thank you and enjoy your evening.
Let me represent, I found my t-shirt.
Yay!
I had some guy in an airport, I think, insist to me, that's the Weather Channel, right?
And the nice thing is you can still fit it.
That's the important part.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Donna and Marguerite.